Well, as we take the next step towards the 2024 election, you should be expecting endorsements to come rolling out en masse. And it appears that we have now seen an endorsement from the architect of the Iraq War. Dick Cheney has now announced that he will be supporting Kamala Harris. And realistically, this was actually announced by his daughter in an interview on MSNBC. But what I find most remarkable about this is that they're claiming, well, Dick Cheney just disagrees so much with Kamala Harris, but to save democracy, he's going to stand forward and stand firm with the Democrats. I've never seen a glowing endorsement of Donald Trump in my entire life akin to that of what we've seen with Dick Cheney endorsing Kamala Harris, the man who quite literally wields major responsibility for over 1 million people being slaughtered in Iraq, for the travesty that was the Afghanistan war. 20 years in the Middle East to sit there and try and overthrow 3,000 years of culture so that we could structure society into that of a modern Western democracy. Are you serious right now? That is exactly what we're dealing with. The same liberals, progressives, and Democrats that for so long talked about how Dick Cheney is a war criminal, which they were right about, a war profiteer, which they were right about, a disgusting, vile human, unworthy of breathing air that trees provide, which they were right about. But what we can see is that now, as we understand the nature of the political shift is changing the landscape itself that we walk within, it's very clear that it has shifted so drastically that the lines have been drawn simply between those who support the machinations of the censorship industrial complex and the war party, and those who simply want to live free, just, and dutiful lives. Starting with the Oregonian, we see former Vice President Dick Cheney says he will not vote for Trump. And I wonder who it could possibly be that he would be voting for. Obviously, we already know the answer to this. When I saw someone like RFK Jr. enter the political landscape, talking about ending the endless foreign adventurism, do you think that that was going to be something that curried Dick Cheney's favor? Do you think that Donald Trump talking about reducing the size and scale of the deep state, stopping the forever wars, is going to be something that curried favor with Dick Cheney, a literal war hawk, someone who salivates over the blood of innocent people and the profits that can be raked in over their corpses by these massive institutional lobbying firms? Of course, you see that him representing nothing more than the regime by endorsing Kamala Harris, well, that should have always been expected. Here we jump into the Associated Press and we see former Vice President Dick Cheney says he will vote for Kamala Harris. And actually, it wasn't even Dick Cheney himself specifically who had made this announcement. It was actually Liz Cheney in an interview claiming that, yes, her father will in fact be endorsing Kamala Harris for president.
We just got more breaking news from Republican Liz Cheney. Remember, she said that she wasn't just against Trump, but she felt, as a defense of democracy, she was going to vote for Kamala Harris, someone who she has significant policy differences with. And now she's talking about who her father will be voting for.
Dick Cheney, your father, a beloved figure among Democrats for many, many years. Do you, if you know who he will be supporting or who he'll be voting for, do you care to share with us who he might be voting for?
Dick Cheney will be voting for Kamala Harris.
And there you have it. One of the literal worst human beings on planet Earth has now endorsed Kamala Harris for president. And I'm not talking about Liz Cheney. The thing is that I find so remarkable specifically about every single bit of this is how the left has completely shifted the dynamic of what they used to represent and how now they've been psyoped into supporting whatever standard that the regime demands. And this tweet from Orrin McIntyre really highlights it perfectly. Leftists now have Dick Cheney, Bill Kristol, Google, Raytheon, Citibank, the CIA, FBI, and Pfizer on their side. Isn't that just something? Does anyone remember when the left, progressives, and anti-war leftists were so consistently advocating against people like Dick Cheney and Bill Kristol architects of the Iraq War, people who were advocating for the project for a new American century. Does anyone remember when leftists and progressives were angry at Google for putting their thumb on the scale surrounding things like Occupy Wall Street, distorting the information that was getting out to people? Does anyone remember when leftists were mad at the government for using massive arms manufacturing companies like Raytheon for producing weapons that they then sell using government-established contracts to rake in buku bucks from dropping bombs on innocent people? Does anyone remember when the left and progressives were freaking out about the banker bailouts during Occupy Wall Street, talking about the fact that it's not the... It's not the fact of you versus me versus you. It's us versus the banks, the 99% versus the 1%. Does anyone remember when the left used to openly talk about how the intelligence agencies are a threat to the United States and that they are responsible for taking the life of someone like John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy? No. Does anyone remember when the left was against things like Pfizer and Big Pharma, but now all they do is the bidding for them? They have literally been psyoped into supporting everything that they used to stand against. It's unbelievable. Moving on now to Clint Russell Lisi. Seen as the Democrats are now the party of endless wars, spying, censorship, the intelligence agencies, crony capitalism, big pharma, big tech, and the military-industrial complex, it makes complete sense that Dick Cheney would be voting for them. And that's absolutely right, because the fact is that they have literally been reoriented into no longer representing the standards of what classical liberalism once was. And you can see the fact that this new generation of progressives and liberals within that of the American political zeitgeist, well, they're completely detached from what it meant to actually represent liberal ideals. And if you need any proof of that, look no further here than this tweet from Harry J. Sisson. Hey, George W. Bush, it's time for you to endorse VP Kamala Harris and put country over party. Sincerely, the American people. This is a real tweet. Someone actually posted that exists within the liberal mindset. The fact is that these people are not liberals. They are nothing more than authoritarians at this point, and I think it truly is something that would be the hallmark of why someone akin to Dick Cheney and his ilk would be willing to step behind supporting someone like Kamala Harris. I think Tucker Carlson, in one of his most recent live events, had the perfect explanation of exactly why it is that someone like Dick Cheney would be willing to support the Democrats.
What they actually care about is the ability to continue to fight pointless wars, because that's where all the money is. That's where all the money is. And if you don't believe it, maybe you haven't checked your phone today to see that Dick Cheney and his horrible daughter have endorsed Kamala Harris. Dick Cheney. Now, why is that? What does Dick Cheney have in common with Kamala Harris? And it's really interesting, actually, because they're constantly telling us that the divides are along race and gender. And they were always telling us Dick Cheney is this rich white guy, and Kamala Harris is this oppressed woman of color. They've got nothing in common. But actually, they have everything in common. Because they're both neocons. That's exactly right. They have everything in common. And it tells you what a lie this race and gender stuff is. That's not the divide. The divide is in your heart. And if you think it's okay to kill people in order to get rich, you're on their side. And if you don't, you're on our side, no matter what you look like.
I find it quite fascinating to double up an understanding of what I said with the message Tucker Carlson was delivering and apply that filter to an article title such as what you see here, and it should allow you to see through the veil and understand what these words actually mean. Here you see from Reuters, Harris says Dick and Liz Cheney put country above party with endorsements. And what this should actually say is, Harris says Dick and Liz Cheney put the Uniparty above the country and its longevity with recent endorsements. Moving on now, here we see Kamala Harris calls Liz and Dick Cheney's endorsements courageous during Pittsburgh appearance. Ah, yes, because there's nothing more courageous than supporting the bankers, the military-industrial complex, and the entirety of the United States government itself. No, it wouldn't have been courageous to stand against that system and say, I cannot acquiesce because I don't support the standards of what you're trying to visit not only upon the United States but the world. No, that wouldn't have been courageous. Bending the knee and licking the boot, that's courage. Here we see from Newsweek, Cheney's support gives Republicans permission to vote for Harris. If you needed the support of Dick Cheney to make your vote, I'd argue your moral compass is more broken than Jack Sparrow's. Anyways, what we're going to go ahead now and jump onto would be this from The Hill. Cheney, I was right about Iraq. What? You were right about Iraq? 1 million people killed, trillions of dollars added to the debt, and devastation of the region. Once again, we see one of the architects of American foreign venturism having no, and I mean zero, desire to accept responsibility for the travesty of what we saw, whether it be the 1 million people in Iraq that were slaughtered or the veteran suicide epidemic that has graced our shores because of the actions of what many of those men that you were willing to go send off and fight abroad in these endless conflicts were dying and suffering through. They now have endless turmoil that rots their mind and plagues their soul. But does that matter to someone like Dick Cheney? No, because apparently he'll just say, well, I was right about Iraq.
It's the Middle East, and stuff happens in the Middle East. You know it, you've covered it for years. But you cannot, I don't think you can make a case that the world would be better off today if Saddam Hussein were still in power.
So no regrets about Iraq?
I think we made exactly the right decisions.
That is a real clip of Dick Cheney taking no responsibility for the devastation that hit Iraq or the travesty of what American servicemen had to suffer from the actions that they had to take when being deployed in a region such as that. No, it's not something like that, because as you know, he claims that, well, we did everything right in Iraq and things just happen in the Middle East. And what is it that is one of those things that just happens, you see? Could it possibly be contractors like those that someone akin to Dick Cheney does the bidding of, making, I don't know, billions of dollars? Well, yes, it is. Here we can see from the Financial Times, contractors reaping $138 billion from the Iraq War. And now you know exactly why someone like Dick Cheney thinks we made all of the right decisions, because he made buku bucks off of it. Here we see, 8 days after the invasion of Iraq on March 19, 2003, Paul Wolfowitz, then Deputy Defense Secretary and a leading proponent of the war, told a congressional committee, wait on it, we are dealing with a country that can really finance its own reconstruction, and relatively soon. Absolutely unbelievable. Here you see it says a decade later that assessment could hardly have turned out to be more wrong. And it's because it was never an accurate analysis from the jump, and they knew it wasn't going to be capable. But did it matter to people like Dick Cheney? No. Here we can see, moving down to the rest of this in yellow, an analysis by the Financial Times reveals the extent of which both American and foreign companies have profited from the conflict, with the top 10 contractors securing business worth at least $72 billion between them. None has benefited more than KBR, once known as Kellogg Brown and Root, the controversial former subsidiary of Halliburton, which was once run by Dick Cheney, vice president of George W. Bush, which was awarded at least $39.5 billion in federal contracts related to the Iraq War over the past decade. And why is it that they were awarded those contracts specifically? Because of how hard Dick Cheney dropped the ball when he was on the board of Halliburton. So what we see here is that he's effectively trying to buy and curry good favor with those individuals. But as we know, it doesn't matter the travesty of what we saw hit the Middle East or the soldiers of the United States. Dick Cheney feels no remorse. Just like those within that of, I don't know, the current Democrat establishment support the same exact actions of what we saw pushed by Dick Cheney. Because the Uniparty will do nothing more than advocate for endless war and conflict, and that is exactly what Kamala Harris is a candidate for. I'm going to go ahead and call it there. Thank you for watching if you got this far. Thumbs up if you liked it, thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Stay lovely, stay great, and most importantly, my friends, tell someone you love them. Peace out.